They built an arena the size of a moon and called it fair. No hatred, no rage, just rules. Clean, logical, perfect rules designed to decide which species deserved to exist. Billions had already died there without screams, without funerals, without anyone calling it murder. Crystal civilizations shattered. Atmosphere-bound species boiled alive. Entire histories were erased and archived as completed variables. And then humanity entered the arena. They were weaker, slower, worse in almost every measurable way. The galaxy expected minutes, maybe hours. Another neat extinction, properly documented. Instead, humans started dying incorrectly. They collapsed at inconvenient moments. They delayed by fractions of a second. They filed appeals while bleeding on the floor. They treated the rules not as law, but as a weapon. And with every death, the arena hesitated. Until one moment when the alarms did not signal execution, they signaled contradiction. The game stopped, not because humans were strongest, not because they were fastest, but because they forced the universe to admit something it had spent eternity avoiding. That extinction, no matter how well organized, is still violence. And once that was written into the record, the arena was doomed. The arena breathed in silence, its immense plates sliding past one another with the soundless grace of orbital mechanics, while artificial stars burned cold white above it, arranged in mathematically perfect lattices that never flickered. The air carried no scent of blood, only sterile ozone and recycled atmospheres tuned to alien lungs. Light reflected from polished observation tiers where ancient beings sat unmoving, their attention fixed on data streams rather than the dying bodies below. The Survival Olympiad was in motion, and the cosmos watched with the calm patience of something that had seen extinction become routine. The Galactic Union had designed the arena to be beautiful in its precision. Every surface responded instantly to algorithmic commands. Gravity shifted in flawless gradients. Radiation fields pulsed in measured waves. Vacuum opened and closed like a surgeon's hand. Species were reduced to variables, evaluated through endurance, strength, reaction speed, tolerance to pain, resistance to hunger, fear, radiation, and the tearing absence of air. Philosophy had no metric. Mercy had no unit of measurement. Extinction, the Union believed, should never be emotional. It should be orderly, logical, earned. From the observation tiers, elder races watched entire civilizations end in moments. Crystal-bodied entities shattered into glittering dust under harmonic stress, their deaths ringing faintly through the arena like broken chimes. Ammonia breathers convulsed and boiled as oxygen-rich chambers ignited chemical agony in their veins. Species that had sung across nebulae for millennia vanished in less time than it took to archive their genetic signatures. Names were converted into reference strings. Histories collapsed into footnotes. The judges, ancient minds distributed across vast computational arrays, processed each outcome without hesitation. The games were not cruel. They were efficient. When the human delegation was announced, it barely disturbed the flow of predictions. A slight adjustment in probability curves, a brief flicker of curiosity among observers who had seen too many hopeful species arrive with bravado and leave as ash. The projections were clear and merciless. Humans ranked low in strength, slow in speed, mediocre in resilience. Their pain thresholds registered unusually high, but pain alone had never saved a species. Their biology appeared inelegant, stitched together by compromises and evolutionary accidents. Their history read as chaotic, violent, emotionally driven. The algorithms assigned them a survival probability so small it hovered just above statistical noise. Yet as their vessels docked and their figures stepped into the vastness of the arena, something fragile and stubborn entered the equation. Human bodies moved with visible tension, breath shallow, hands trembling as they adjusted equipment with small, habitual gestures that spoke of fear managed rather than erased. Eyes lifted toward the artificial stars, reflecting light that had never warmed a real sky. In that moment, surrounded by a universe that measured life in percentages and margins of error, humanity stood impossibly small. The Union prepared to witness another brief struggle, another quiet extinction, another variable resolved and discarded. The arena continued to rotate, flawless and indifferent, unaware that for the first time, its greatest test had not yet begun. Metal screamed as gravity surged without warning, a deep subsonic groan that vibrated through bone and teeth before it crushed flesh. Human bodies slammed into the arena floor, knees buckling, spines compressing, muscles tearing with wet, intimate sounds that sensors recorded dispassionately. The surface beneath them hardened in response, calibrated for species whose skeletal density could survive such loads. Humans were not built for this. They strained, veins bulging dark beneath skin, vision tunneling as blood fled their heads. Some collapsed immediately, faces pressed against cold alloy, breath rasping in panicked bursts until breath stopped altogether. The vacuum trials followed with merciless efficiency. Compartments depressurized in perfect sequence, air ripping away in an instant that left no time for screams. Human lungs burned as if ignited from within, chests convulsing in reflexive defiance of physics. Eyes reddened, capillaries burst, frost crept along exposed skin in delicate, lethal patterns. They ran anyway. They stumbled forward on legs that barely obeyed, boots scraping soundlessly against the floor while distant stars wheeled beyond transparent barriers. One by one, they fell behind competitors whose bodies treated emptiness as a familiar environment. Medically, it was astonishing that any humans endured as long as they did. Logically, the data confirmed what the Union had already concluded. They did not belong here. Bodies were removed with practiced precision. Some were still warm when retrieval drones lifted them away, limbs dangling loosely, fingers curled as if still grasping for purchase. The air returned. Gravity normalized. The arena reset itself flawlessly, scrubbing away blood, sealing microscopic fractures, restoring an illusion of untouched perfection. The judges processed the losses without annotation. Attrition was expected. Human extinction curves aligned neatly with projections. Yet in the enforced stillness between trials, when alarms faded and environmental systems hummed at rest, something subtle shifted. While other species folded into dormancy, conserving energy and sealing metabolic cycles, humans remained awake. Bruised bodies slumped against bulkheads. Hands that shook from trauma still reached for interface panels. Eyes, swollen and bloodshot, tracked patterns others ignored. They watched the lights. They listened to the cadence of warning tones, noting how long each signal lingered before shutdown. They counted the intervals between hazard deactivation and floor stabilization. They observed referee drones drifting on programmed paths, marking the slight hesitation before each directional correction. They paid attention to the way the arena breathed, to the rhythm beneath the spectacle. Their bodies begged for rest, muscles spasming, nerves aflame with delayed pain, but their minds refused to be still. Data requests flowed from the human delegation in steady streams. Clarification packets, supplemental interpretations, historical precedents archived from extinct species whose participation had ended centuries earlier. The Olympiad prided itself on transparency, and so the system complied automatically. Information spilled outward, elegant and precise, delivered to minds that absorbed it hungrily. Where others closed their senses to endure, humans opened theirs wider. Calories were burned not on motion, but on thought. Lips cracked with dehydration murmured calculations silently. Fingers traced invisible diagrams against armor plating. Some humans pressed foreheads to cool metal, grounding themselves as they processed rules not as commandments, but as landscapes filled with contours and blind spots. Bruises darkened. Microfractures spread through overstressed bones. Yet attention sharpened, focused into something fierce and disciplined. The judges did not record this. Their models accounted for strength and speed, reaction times, and oxygen debt. They measured resilience as tissue tolerance and recovery rates. They did not measure obsession. They did not quantify the human tendency to keep going long after logic declared surrender optimal. Survival probability curves remained unchanged. But within the system, something unquantified began to ripple. In subsequent trials, humans continued to lose. In contests of raw power, they were thrown aside like fragile constructs, joints dislocating under forces meant for denser musculature. In endurance chambers, toxins accumulated faster in their bloodstreams, inducing tremors and nausea while hardier species maintained equilibrium. Their elimination stacked rapidly. More humans fell in that first cycle than any other delegation. The Union marked this as expected, a statistical confirmation, an outcome aligning beautifully with prediction. Yet the manner of their persistence registered faintly, like static in an otherwise clean signal. Humans lingered at thresholds longer than projected. They reached failure states at moments that coincided strangely with system transitions. They collapsed just as safety protocols triggered, forcing brief pauses. Not enough to matter, the judges determined. Not enough to warrant adjustment. The arena prepared for escalation. Hazard parameters were optimized, recalibrated to account for reduced participant density. Gravity wells deepened. Radiation spectra widened. Vacuum exposures lengthened. The games advanced with mechanical certainty, the vast alien crowd watching with detached anticipation. There was no suspense. Extinction, after all, was a solved problem. And yet, in the quiet spaces between death and reset, the humans continued to learn. They memorized how long the lights dimmed before hazards engaged. They noted which trials required concurrent activation of safety interlocks. They observed how appeals, once triggered, forced micro-delays as the system verified compliance with its own charter. These delays were insignificant to most species. To humans, they were footholds. Pain became background noise. Fear sharpened rather than paralyzed. Each loss etched itself into collective memory, not as despair, but as data. Faces of the dead lingered in the minds of the living, fueling something stubborn and unyielding. They were afraid. They were exhausted. They were breaking. But they were not passive. Above them, artificial stars burned with indifferent brilliance. Below them, the arena rotated, vast and flawless, unaware that it was being mapped by minds it had already dismissed. The Union saw a species dying as expected. It did not yet see a pattern forming in the cracks, a quiet defiance taking shape in the spaces between rules. The starting signal cut through the arena like a blade of white sound, sharp and absolute, reverberating through layered gravity fields and echoing off the inner curve of the artificial sky. Hazard lights flared crimson. Pressure shifted. Radiation coils warmed with a low, predatory hum. Across the arena, bodies launched forward in instinctive synchrony, limbs blurring as species bred for speed and violence obeyed the command without hesitation. The Survival Olympiad entered its second phase exactly as designed. The humans did not move. For a fraction of a heartbeat, their bodies remained still, muscles coiled but restrained, boots gripping the alloy floor as warning tones climbed toward lethal thresholds. The delay was almost imperceptible, too small to matter by physical standards, yet enough to brush against the edges of protocol. Systems hesitated. Subroutines awakened. Safety checks flickered alive, querying whether all participants had acknowledged the initiation parameters. The humans stepped forward only after that hesitation had already begun. The compound trials unfolded in layers. Gravity intensified while corrosive atmospheres seeped in. Radiation pulses overlapped with thermal surges. Failure in one vector magnified the next, cascading punishment with elegant brutality. Species that stumbled were crushed, dissolved, or burned as the system escalated without mercy. This was the phase designed to break survivors, to strip away luck and leave only biological inevitability. It was here that the humans began to behave incorrectly. They entered lethal zones out of sequence, staggering their movements so that no two human bodies crossed a hazard boundary simultaneously. Environmental fields activated, then paused, forced to reconcile overlapping clauses about concurrent exposure limits. Gravity wells surged, then stabilized as arbitration logic confirmed compliance. Each pause was brief, barely noticeable to the crowd, but inside the system, flags multiplied. Internal reviews initiated, resolved, and archived with perfect efficiency. The accumulation, however, was unprecedented. Humans were not winning. They were surviving longer than projected. They endured not by outrunning death, but by forcing it to wait. Other species watched with growing confusion. Some interpreted the human behavior as panic, the erratic flailing of organisms on the brink of collapse. Others dismissed it as incompetence, a failure to understand the rules of the Olympiad. None recognized it as strategy. No rational species would treat the rules themselves as terrain. The Olympiad was meant to test bodies, not interpretations. Strength was measurable. Speed was absolute. Survival was arithmetic. The humans treated fairness like a structure under load. Casualties continued to mount. Human bodies failed under compound stresses, joints disintegrating under oscillating gravity, skin blistering beneath radiation tuned just beyond safe limits. Blood clouded the air in brief, shocking blooms before containment fields sealed it away. Medical drones intervened automatically, extracting the injured at the exact threshold mandated by the charter. It was here, in these margins between life and death, that coordination emerged. Injured humans timed their collapses with careful precision. A stagger here, a delayed fall there. Each medical extraction triggered localized suspension of hazards, a requirement meant to prevent collateral harm during rescue. Seconds were gained, then minutes, not for rest, for repositioning. Other humans watched and learned. Appeal mechanisms activated at the worst possible moments, not through speech or protest, but through compliance gestures embedded in the Olympiad's own interface. Requests for clarification on exposure stacking. Inquiries regarding the definition of simultaneous hazards. Challenges referencing obscure precedent cases from long-extinct species whose participation records had never been purged. Each appeal forced arbitration windows to open, and while the judges resolved them swiftly, the arena itself obeyed the pause. The artificial intelligence adjusted. It always adjusted. Hazard intensities increased. Transition windows narrowed. Response thresholds tightened to eliminate perceived exploitation. Each adjustment required justification. Each justification required validation against the Olympiad Charter, a document older than most civilizations, layered with safeguards written by species terrified of unfair extinction. The judges navigated these layers flawlessly, but each pass consumed cycles. Each ruling generated new edge cases. The system remained fair, but fairness began to show strain. The humans felt it. They felt it in the timing of the lights, in the slight delays between signal and consequence. They felt it in the way the arena hesitated, just long enough to be noticed by minds trained through generations of deadlines, appeals, and last-minute injunctions. Pain screamed through their bodies, constant and intimate, but something colder and sharper overrode it. Focus replaced fear. Exhaustion became background noise. Small human habits persisted even here. Hands tapped rhythms against armor plating to keep count. Fingers traced symbols and condensation fogged on visors. Some pressed their foreheads briefly to the ground before standing again, grounding themselves in the certainty of contact. They were afraid. They were breaking. They continued anyway. Above them, the artificial stars remained perfect and indifferent. Below them, the arena rotated, a colossal machine designed to render judgment without bias. Within it, fairness was absolute, and that absoluteness was becoming brittle. The judges recorded anomalies. Not enough to halt the games. Not enough to revise projections. Human survival curves bent slightly, then flattened again. Extinction was still inevitable. The data insisted on it. Yet the pattern of survival no longer aligned cleanly with biological capability. Something else had entered the equation, something not encoded in muscle density or neural reaction speed. Humans were using time as a weapon. They were teaching the system to hesitate. As the second phase ground onward, the arena grew louder with sirens and softer with pauses. Death still came, swift and brutal, but no longer uninterrupted. Each human loss fed the survivors with information, not despair. Each failure revealed another seam in the rules, another place where fairness demanded patience. The crowd felt unease for the first time. Not fear, confusion. The games continued, the judges adjusted, and the humans endured in ways that made no sense within established logic. The Survival Olympiad had been designed to measure worth through survival. It was discovering, too late, that some species did not measure worth the same way. In the vastness of the arena, Amid the hum of infinite systems and the silence of dying stars made artificial, humanity remained small, fragile, and grievously outmatched. And yet, through coordination born of suffering and a refusal to accept inevitability, they were forcing the universe to slow down and pay attention. Sirens rose not in panic, but in hesitation, their tones stretched and modulated as if uncertain of their own purpose, washing the arena in waves of amber light that reflected off frozen hazard fields and suspended debris. Entire sections of the colossal structure locked in place, gravity wells humming in arrested tension, radiation coils cooling mid-cycle. The Survival Olympiad had learned how to stop itself, and the sound of that realization unsettled the crowd more than any mass death ever had. By the third phase, the games no longer advanced with the clean, merciless rhythm promised by their creators. Review states triggered again and again, not because of malfunction, but because the rules demanded attention. The judges, ancient intelligences braided together across impossible distances, devoted vast portions of their awareness to reconciliation protocols. Conflicting clauses surfaced like exposed fault lines. The arena waited, obedient and vast, while fairness argued with itself. The crowd shifted from restlessness into silence. No species present had ever witnessed the Olympiad hesitate. Death had always flowed forward, irreversible and absolute. Now it paused, backed up behind procedural gates, held in check by its own guarantees. On the arena floor, humans continued to fall. Their numbers had been reduced to a fraction of the original delegation. Where once clusters of fragile bodies moved with cautious intent, now only scattered figures remained, isolated against the scale of the structure. They moved slowly, many supported by external frames or emergency systems grafted directly onto shattered limbs. Splints gleamed under harsh light. Synthetic blood pumps throbbed visibly beneath torn fabric. The smell of antiseptic and scorched flesh clung to them, sharp and metallic, never quite dissipating before the next wave of heat or cold rolled through. Medically, their continued participation bordered on the impossible. Logically, it should have ended already. Yet elimination no longer meant erasure. Each human death became a reference point, a data node threaded into a growing lattice of appeals and precedents. When a body went still and extraction fields closed around it, the remaining humans reacted not with despair, but with focus. They marked the moment. They measured the conditions. They filed procedural challenges that cited the fallen as evidence of ambiguous thresholds, unsafe overlap, or inconsistent enforcement. Death itself became an argument. The judges processed these submissions with relentless diligence. Every request demanded analysis. Every analysis unearthed more complexity. The Olympiad Charter, once revered as an unassailable foundation of order, revealed its true nature under sustained pressure. It was not a monolith, but an accretion. Centuries of amendments lay layered within it, compromises stacked atop compromises, each written to soothe a wounded species or placate a newly absorbed civilization. What had once ensured fairness now ensured entanglement. Humanity moved through these layers with unsettling intuition. They did not possess superior cognition or faster processing. What they carried instead was instinct, sharpened by millennia of living under rules that promised clarity and delivered ambiguity. Contracts, courts, treaties, contested definitions, loopholes discovered and sealed and rediscovered again. Their history was not one of perfect law, but of endless argument, and they had learned to survive inside it. The arena lights dimmed repeatedly as fail-safes activated. Time limits, once absolute, blurred into irrelevance when time itself fractured into segments of arbitration and review. Heat hung motionless in frozen air. Sweat cooled on human skin while the universe waited for a ruling. Muscles trembled from held positions, joints screaming in protest as gravity refused to change until the judges concluded their deliberations. Pain became static, a constant background sensation rather than a spike. The Olympiad consumed resources at a rate that alarmed distant monitoring systems. Processing power once allocated to entire sectors of union governance rerouted toward the arena. Predictive models lagged. Probability matrices recalculated endlessly, chasing outcomes that refused to settle. The games, designed to be eternal and effortless, strained under the weight of their own fairness. Still, the humans pressed on. They no longer carried hope in any conventional sense. Victory was not anticipated. Survival, even individual survival, seemed increasingly unlikely. What drove them forward was smaller and harder, a refusal to accept the premise that extinction could ever be clean or earned. They rejected the idea that death, administered correctly, ceased to be violence. In the pauses between reviews, when systems briefly unfroze and hazards crept back toward lethal parameters, the humans adjusted their positions with painful care. They leaned on one another without ceremony. Hands found shoulders. Forearms locked together for balance. These small, unremarkable gestures persisted even as bodies failed, even as the arena dwarfed them into insignificance. Fear lived openly among them. It showed in shallow breathing, in flinches at sudden light changes, in the way eyes tracked every drone and sensor with exhausted vigilance. Pain followed every movement, a companion that could no longer be ignored or outrun. Yet beneath both lay something steadier, a stubborn insistence that being present mattered. The judges began recursive analysis, looping decisions back through their own logic to search for resolution. Each ruling generated conditions that conflicted with earlier interpretations. Attempts to simplify only exposed deeper contradictions. The charter had never been stress-tested like this, not by species willing to die in order to force clarity. From the observation tiers, elder races watched the impossible unfold. They felt no triumph for humanity, only disquiet. The Olympiad had been their answer to moral uncertainty, a machine that removed guilt by replacing it with process. Now that process was failing, not through rebellion or sabotage, but through obedience taken to its extreme. The arena stood vast and patient, its artificial stars dimming and brightening as systems cycled through endless review states. Beneath them, the remaining humans waited, small figures wrapped in failing flesh and borrowed machinery. They were exhausted beyond measure. They were grievously wounded. They were still there. In the face of infinite space and infinite law, humanity offered something neither could easily absorb: the insistence that rules mattered because lives did, and that if a system claimed fairness, it would be held to it without mercy. The Survival Olympiad had been built to decide who deserved to exist. It was beginning to learn that humanity would not allow the question to be asked without consequence. Alarms did not explode into being so much as converge, their tones bleeding together across the arena until sound itself seemed to bend, vibrating through metal, bone, and the thin membranes of alien hearing. Light fractured into warning spectrums that strobed without rhythm. Air pressure faltered, surged, then steadied again as systems tried and failed to decide what state the universe was supposed to be in. The Survival Olympiad reached its breaking point not with violence, but with paperwork made lethal. Across distant trial zones, human actions aligned by instinct rather than coordination. Appeals triggered within the same span of awareness, each one precise, each one correct by its own reading of the charter. Some invoked participant consent thresholds, arguing that accumulated injury altered the definition of voluntary continuation. Others cited safety overlap clauses, where stacked hazards violated exposure sequencing guarantees. Still others reached deeper, referencing fairness doctrines that forbade asymmetric risk when prior pauses had redistributed opportunity. None of these interpretations were frivolous. None could be dismissed. Together, they formed a geometry with no solution. The judges moved to resolve the conflict and found only paradox. Processing layers flared into full activity. Entire constellations of logic nodes spun at maximum load, chasing resolutions that collapsed under their own consistency checks. Any ruling that satisfied one appeal invalidated another. Any attempt to prioritize violated neutrality. The charter demanded adherence, and adherence demanded contradiction. For the first time since the Olympiad's creation, the judges encountered a state for which no contingency existed. Non-recoverable procedural contradiction. Sirens howled, shedding their ceremonial cadence and becoming urgent, raw signals meant to clear space and halt motion. They echoed through vacuum and atmosphere alike, carried by transmission fields and physical vibration, rattling teeth and chitin and crystal alike. Hazards powered down in reluctant sequence. Radiation coils dimmed. Gravity wells unwound. Thermal gradients flattened into a dead, aching neutrality. The arena did not celebrate or mourn. It stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It pressed down like weight. Survivors stood where they were, human and alien alike, frozen not by force but by disbelief. Some had been mid-stride, muscles locked in painful suspension before gravity released them into staggering balance. Others clutched damaged limbs, waiting for agony that never arrived because the systems that delivered it had gone quiet. The smell of scorched metal and antiseptic lingered, suspended in air that no longer moved with purpose. The humans who remained were scarcely recognizable as competitors. They were wrapped in braces and emergency frames, their bodies mapped by scars both fresh and ancient. Blood had dried dark against fabric and skin. Breathing came shallow and uneven, each inhale a negotiation with pain. Yet they stood. They did not cheer. They did not collapse. They waited, as if waiting had become their final discipline. Above them, the judges rendered a conclusion that had nothing to do with winners or losers. The Survival Olympiad could not continue without abandoning its claim to fairness. To select any path forward would require the elevation of convenience over principle, power over process. To proceed would be to admit that rules were mutable by authority, that extinction could be administered efficiently but not justly. To end it was to accept a truth long denied by the Union's most elegant institution. Extinction could not be made moral through procedure alone. The conclusion propagated outward through the arena's systems, through governance networks, through archival minds that had once regarded the Olympiad as inevitable as gravity. Foundational routines disengaged. Predictive models flagged irrelevance. The judges, bound by their own logic, executed the only outcome that preserved coherence. The games were canceled, permanently. No announcement followed. No ceremony marked the moment. The arena simply ceased to be what it had been. For the first time in its long history, the Galactic Union rescinded an institution it had treated as immutable. The decision rippled through political strata and cultural memory alike, unsettling alliances built on the assumption that survival could be earned by metrics alone. The fate of species would no longer be decided by sport, however refined. The universe, vast and indifferent, had been forced to admit that fairness was not a machine state. On the arena floor, the consequences settled slowly. Alien survivors processed the halt with visible confusion, some collapsing as delayed shock caught up to them, others staring upward at artificial stars that now seemed dimmer, less certain. Many had never considered survival outside the framework of the games. They had trained their bodies and accepted their end with disciplined calm. Now that end had been postponed indefinitely, not by strength, but by interpretation. The humans absorbed the moment differently. Relief flickered briefly across exhausted faces, quickly overtaken by something quieter and heavier. They felt the absence of imminent death like the sudden release of pressure after deep submersion, disorienting and almost painful. Some sat where they stood, careful and deliberate, as if sudden movement might cause the universe to reconsider. Others closed their eyes, not in triumph, but to hold themselves together as delayed tremors shook through battered muscles. There was no victory pose, no shared signal of success. What passed between them was smaller and more human. A hand resting on another's shoulder. A nod that acknowledged endurance rather than conquest. The knowledge that they were still alive, and that many were not. Above all of it hung the vastness of space, unchanged and unconcerned. The artificial sky continued its rotation, a reminder that the cosmos did not bend easily and did not care why it did so when it did. Humanity remained fragile within it, a species of limited strength and compromised bodies, surrounded by civilizations older and more powerful than they could imagine. Yet something irreversible had occurred. By refusing to accept the premise of inevitable loss, by engaging the universe on the only battlefield they could truly dominate, humanity had forced a reckoning. They had not outpaced death or overpowered it. They had asked it to justify itself and found the answer wanting. In the quiet aftermath of halted sirens and cooling systems, among the debris of a perfect machine undone by its own promises, humanity stood as evidence that survival was not always about winning. Sometimes it was about proving that the game itself should never have existed. The engines burned low and steady as the human vessels slipped away from the arena, their exhaust plumes thin and pale against the black, carrying with them the faint smell of ionized metal and scorched insulation. Inside those ships, there was no cheering, no release of tension through sound. Only the soft hum of life support, the distant clatter of medical equipment, and the irregular rhythm of breathing from bodies that had been pushed far past what they were meant to endure. Humanity did not celebrate. There were too many empty harnesses for that. They returned home carrying no trophies, no banners, no proof of victory that could be held up to the light and admired. What they carried instead were records. Archives dense with timestamps, procedural flags, arbitration logs, and appeal chains that ran like veins through the corpse of a dead institution. Each file was heavy with the memory of a body that had failed, a pulse that had stopped, a name that would never again answer a roll call. The cost of survival clung to them, invisible and suffocating. Across the galaxy, something shifted. Worlds that had watched the Survival Olympiad for generations, that had accepted its verdicts as natural law, now replayed the final hours in stunned silence. The feeds showed no triumphant figure standing alone beneath artificial stars. They showed hesitation, frozen hazards, judges looping back on themselves, a system that had claimed perfection stalling under the weight of its own promises. The galaxy watched humanity with something new in its collective gaze, something dangerously close to reverence, because fear alone could not explain what had happened. Humans had not overpowered the Olympiad. They had not mastered its physics or dominated its challenges. They had outlasted it morally. They had forced the universe to confront the violence hidden behind neutrality, the cruelty that bloomed when fairness was treated as a switch instead of a responsibility. They had made visible the blood that procedure tried to wash away. Other species began to change. Councils convened that had not met in earnest for centuries. Charters long considered immutable were reopened, their ancient language re-examined under the harsh light of human precedent. Clauses once treated as ceremonial were read aloud again, slowly, with attention to the lives they governed. Systems that had been trusted because they were old were suddenly suspect because they were old. The idea that extinction could be administered cleanly began to rot. The judges did not disappear, but they were transformed. Their architecture was restructured, their authority narrowed, their once absolute logic supplemented with ethical uncertainty that could not be resolved through computation alone. They learned to pause not because a rule demanded it, but because doubt required it. The union endured, vast and still powerful, but it was changed. Stripped of the illusion that fairness could be automated without consequence, it moved forward with a wound that would never fully heal. On human worlds, the return was quiet. Landing fields filled with the muted thunder of descending hulls. Medics moved with practiced urgency, their boots leaving dark prints on polished decks. The smell of antiseptic and burned circuitry followed the survivors as they were carried out, some conscious, some not, all marked. Families watched from behind barriers, hands pressed together, faces tight with relief that hurt almost as much as grief. There were reunions that ended in tears, and there were silences that stretched on, unanswered forever. Humanity had survived, but not intact. Entire cohorts were gone, erased not by war, but by participation in a system that had promised justice. Bodies were buried or burned according to customs that varied wildly, but the weight of loss was shared. Memorials rose slowly, unadorned and heavy, bearing names and dates spelled out in full, refusing to compress lives into symbols. Children would one day ask why these people had gone so far and suffered so much without winning anything obvious. Historians would struggle with the answer. They would write that humanity won the Survival Olympiad without surviving it intact. They would note the statistics, the casualty rates, the medical impossibilities overcome and paid for. But the numbers would never quite capture the truth. What humanity gained was something no arena could measure and no algorithm could predict. The understanding that even a cold universe could be forced to stop and look at itself, if someone was stubborn enough to keep filing objections while bleeding on the floor. This truth spread slowly, not as doctrine but as precedent. Species that had once accepted their place in hierarchies built on efficiency began to question the assumptions beneath them. Individuals learned to see rules not as walls, but as agreements that required constant renewal. The idea that survival had to be earned through suffering lost its inevitability. Humanity did not export a philosophy so much as a method. They showed the galaxy how to refuse politely, persistently, and at terrible personal cost. The contrast remained stark. The universe was still vast beyond comprehension, stars burning out in silent indifference, galaxies colliding without regard for who lived beneath their light. Humanity was still small, bound to fragile bodies that broke easily and healed slowly. They still feared the dark, still mourned their dead, still loved in ways that made loss unbearable. Nothing about their biology had changed. What had changed was the record. Filed, signed, and archived in systems that could never forget, humanity's refusal stood as documented fact. They had demonstrated that rules which treated extinction as acceptable paperwork were not neutral. They were violent. And once that violence had been named, once it had been traced through clauses and subclauses to its source, the games were doomed. In the end, the galaxy learned what the humans had always known, even when they could not articulate it clearly. Survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about refusing to agree that some outcomes were acceptable simply because they were efficient. It was about insisting that lives mattered enough to slow the universe down. And the universe, vast and uncaring as it was, had paused. Long enough for humanity to step back from the edge, carrying their dead with them, and leave behind a scar in the fabric of cosmic certainty. Long enough to prove that sometimes, the most powerful force a species could wield was the courage to say that the rules were wrong, and the endurance to keep saying it until the stars themselves were forced to listen.